Hey, wealth builders, Simon Dixon here, and welcome back to another episode. In fact, the second episode of our interview series. I'm going to be going live as usual with Bitcoin Hard Talk episode 40 later. But what I want to do is bring to you some of the people that I don't think get enough credit, despite the fact that they're doing some amazing work for Bitcoin. And with that in mind, in this interview, we're going to be interviewing Adam Nili. So Adam, are you there?
Hey, Simon, how are you?
So Adam, you're at Bitcoin Nashville. Why don't you give a quick introduction to yourself, some of your work, and we're going to be discussing everything that's happening with open source Bitcoin education that started in El Salvador, had a bit of an extension across to Colombia, and is now in multiple countries around the world to support many different countries in the global south in learning more about how Bitcoin can be used. So Adam, while we figure out the tech, why don't you introduce yourself and tell us about what you're up to?
Yeah, well, first of all, hello everyone. Honored to be with you today. Simon and everyone in the audience. My name is Adam Nili. I'm an entrepreneur, and I mostly focus on philanthropic initiatives around the world now. Been a big behind the scenes guy. So everything I do is not really about me. It's about a mission. So I actually enjoy my spot behind the scenes because, and I don't have a large presence because my mission and our goal is to find the right ideas and then find the right people, right? The signal and the noise who understand what it is that we're trying to do. And then I come in on the right execution side because I think, ideas are common, but execution is hard.
We first met because we were talking about some work in El Salvador. I went to go and meet President Bukele and wanted to give him some ideas around the debt restructuring, the Bitcoin volcano bond. What many people don't know is that in 2014, we launched the first Bitcoin volcano bond in the world. It was backed by Volcano Energy and Geocooling in Iceland, and we raised a bunch of money through Bank to the Future that paid out daily dividends in Bitcoin as a registered security. And it made up many of our investors' retirement and actually became one of the highest performing investments because Bitcoin did so well. And this was around about 2014. And so that's when I first met Adam, and Adam came to me sharing about these different types of education and programs that he was creating, and also how he was rolling them out in El Salvador, and on the ground, really just showing everyday people that had heard from their president as this thing called Bitcoin. The story was that, made it legal tender. That was announced in the very same conference that Adam is speaking at, he's attending at the moment. And then this, this rollout happened where they gave everybody $20 worth of Bitcoin. The IMF decided to attack El Salvador and say, if you continue your Bitcoin strategy, then we're not going to be involved in your debt restructuring. Bukele and the finance minister figured out how to restructure it. It created a bit of a lot of volatility in the El Salvador bond market. And everyone started to ridicule. The Bank of England came over to say that they were concerned about people in El Salvador. And really, they mean that they didn't. Why aren't you taking our debt slavery, as I often talk about in Bitcoin Hard Talk? And then you've been on the ground doing some open source education. So why don't you share with us what the early project was like in El Salvador and what open source Bitcoin education means to you?
Yeah, so, early days for me were discovering the project in August of 2022. And I believe you and I were both in El Salvador in the same time. And you were meeting with Bukele, and I was discovering, who was who and what was what in El Salvador. I have a separate project going on at the university level in Colombia through a presidential agency there, and I know we were connected through that project as well. But I was working on a curriculum on financial literacy, right? Because I think I could give you 1,000, well, Simon could give you 1,000 Bitcoin, today, and it would be like a lottery winner. You'd get the money, but you wouldn't know how to manage it. And so I'm working on a financial literacy program along with Bitcoin education program in Colombia. And I fly out to El Salvador and I see what it's like on the ground there. And there was a lack of education and a lack of understanding around Bitcoin. And so you have a problem, right? Now, Bitcoin is currency, it's legal tender, but no one knows how to use it. And so there's this knee-jerk reaction, almost instinctively, we have as humans when something is presented to us and we don't understand it. So there was some initial dislike and distrust, but through good education programs that are taught on the community level, right, from a community leader in the local context, in the local language, what you can find is you can change hearts and minds pretty quickly. So we went from, I think, engaging with a handful of students to several hundred to several thousand to now around 40,000 students impacted all around the world. And around 35,000 of those have been taught in person in El Salvador, where we get you hands-on with the tech. We explain to you why you need money, what it is, what it's been throughout history. We talk about the fiat money system. We talk about who controls money. And it's such an interesting Socratic method applied to education that is intended just to help you ask the right questions, right? So I want you to ask the right questions of the world so you can find the right answers. And more importantly, find answers that you own. Because if you own your answers, right, and you own that process of starting to ask questions about your reality, you can start to poke holes in it. And you can start to find out what is true, and you can differentiate that from what is false. So it's been a really successful initiative, a ton of growth, and now that's spread to 36 different communities around the world in 25 different countries.
So tell us what was happening in Colombia when tell us what's happening with Bitcoin in Colombia.
Yeah, let's do it. So, I think you and I connected 2021 or so. We were on a quick call talking about what was happening in Colombia. And I think this is the story of what happens when good education doesn't exist in the world, right? So 2020 to 2021, according to a chain analysis of report, there were $500 million lost to scams in the global South, in Latin America. And that can only exist in a world where people don't know how to determine fact from fiction. So my organization is called Methodos Capital. We're an international relations and consulting and advisory services company that started, basically with me orange pilling friends and family all across the world 10 years ago. And what it turned into was building relationships of trust in countries with people who had influence. And so my firm was invited to a presidential agency event, and that's where I'd reached out to you to help advise on that side, because I think there's a real problem in Latin America. And one of the organizations that we were up against to be advisors to the university system on the topic of Bitcoin actually wanted to talk about a lot of other alternative currencies. And so, we went in with a really pure ethos, and that was education is the bedrock. It is the foundational layer of society. We want to build prosperity in this country, and we want to do that through Bitcoin education. And the opportunity cost of not choosing us is, and I showed them kind of how to create a coin, how easy it was. I hit 1 and I just kept on hitting zeros until I was basically tired, and showed them how easy it was to create these scam coins. And I said, you know what? The ultimate crime to me is when, you let the wrong actors in at these very high levels, and they start to misinform and miseducate people for their own reward. And that cost, right, of course, gets socialized across Latin America without the proper guardrails. And so what ends up happening is you have people losing hundreds of millions of dollars. These are grandfathers who want a better lives for their grandsons, sons who want a better lives for their parents that are planning. They're trying to plant seeds and determine truth. And so we come in on the education side and we start partnering with the university system to build a pure financial literacy and Bitcoin education curriculum. And that's what we're up to in Colombia. And now we're starting to get traction on that program, and we're talking to other universities in other countries. And I'm really excited to roll this out, because why should just one country lead the world with high quality education? And why should other countries, have to suffer from not having that education? So that's the problem that we're out to solve in Colombia.
There's a lot of interesting things to unpack there. So I remember the first time ever engaging with a sovereign nation was, I think it was 2013. I'd need to look back and check, when I was invited to a meeting with Boris Johnson, who was mayor of London, that later became the Prime Minister of the UK. And I rolled out and gave him a complete Bitcoin strategy. All of the companies were trying to find a sovereign nation that would support them. And we had all of these companies that were becoming bigger and bigger and bigger as the exchange industry was going. And Boris Johnson basically laughed us out of the room and just thought, ain't going to happen. So the next country was the country that I live in now, was Isle of Man. And in 2014, the Isle of Man government saw the opportunity to build an island just for Bitcoin. And it started it started putting in the process to make Bitcoin legal tender. The first process was to accept Bitcoin for taxes. And then it put together a conference, and we got all of the different Bitcoin companies over here. They were all excited, all ready to go. And then they tried to start opening bank accounts, and we learned Operation Choke Point, which was a big thing that happened on the island. Operation Choke Point, where the online gaming companies couldn't get access to banking, even though it was perfectly legal to do online gaming. The Isle of Man actually stood up against America and allowed these companies to exist. They wanted to do the same again. But this time, the objection was from somebody a lot closer to home, which is Bank of England. So the Bank of England then contacts all the banks on the island and contacts the government and says, if you support this sector or Bitcoin, then we're going to remove clearing to your banking system. And so all of the banks operated Operation Choke Point. And then they really just moved further and further away from Bitcoin and over to, ICOs and all that type of stuff as the industry evolved. And it wasn't that, then there was a massive gap. And it wasn't until the conference that you're at, I think it was 2021, when Bukele actually did it, said, I'll stand up to the IMF, I'll stand up to the Bank of England, and I'm going to make it legal tender by hook or by crook. And then they implemented a reserve asset strategy and started publishing more recently their addresses and saying, we're going to accumulate 1 Bitcoin every day, which I believe will be the smartest move in history. And then there was that infamous conference where Bukele brought all of the different finance ministers and central bankers from the global south. Now, I always like to educate my audience. There's the central banks that represent the oppression of the global north. And, it started with European bankers and the Bank of England, which copied the model from the first central bank, the Dutch central bank. And then the European bankers tried to export this model into America. We had Independence Day, where America fought the Brits and the monarchs and expelled them, and they got their independence. And then we tried to find another way of getting in, which was through central banking. We had several presidents assassinated fighting these central banks, whether it be Abraham Lincoln or an Andrew Jackson, that wanted to fight the central banks. But eventually, we managed to cede the Federal Reserve and take over the US economy slowly and take away the Constitution and convert it to a socialist country by implementing the Federal Reserve Act of 1913, We also managed to get American taxpayers to pay for it through introducing an income tax. And the government got occupied by the European bankers and the Federal Reserve. And ever since then, their debts have grown. Wealth inequality has continued to grow because the money that they used to make from printing and creating money and having a transparent money supply was handed over to the private banking system, where they have to charge interest on top. And therefore, Americans keep paying more and more and more, and it siphons off more from the system. We're at the end of a debt cycle in that whole flow that we've been through. And now Bitcoin's become a political issue because America's starting to realize, thanks to RFK, who I believe is speaking shortly after this interview in the conference where you are, he started to understand that because he lost family members due to the deep state and exposing the central banks and exposing the lobby groups which control American politics, which is deeply connected to the central banks. We then got this resistance movement in 2008 as a resistance against central banking, which was Bitcoin. And then when certain countries adopted it, like El Salvador, you had all these people that wanted to oppress the Bitcoin movement again. They wanted to come along and say, hey, why don't you use a country where you can print your own coin? So shortly after El Salvador, there was the Central African Republic that announced Bitcoin as legal tender. And then suddenly, instead of supporting Bitcoin, which they couldn't print, they tried to create their own shitcoin. And then you got Sam Bankman-Fried that would try and occupy El Salvador and say, hey, why don't you support Solana? And then Charles Hoskinson will come along and say, hey, why don't you support Cardano? We'll support you in printing your own money and creating fiat currency on a blockchain, and we can pretend it's decentralized. And so eventually the industry emerges and you have all these virtual assets, but El Salvador has managed to keep that separation between Bitcoin and the other parts of the industry and virtual assets. But we hit an interesting point right now where RFK has said that he would like America to create a counter movement to what I call the occupation from central banks. And Thomas Massie has said, we're going to do an end the Fed bill. Trump said, we're going to do an anti-CBDC bill or commitment. We're going to protect Americans' ability to self-custody their Bitcoin. And maybe either today or tomorrow, we get an announcement. Now, RFK has said, which essentially is the deciding vote, he's going to pull together 10% of the votes and can control whether Kamala Harris wins or whether Trump wins. And he's going to decide which direction he's going to go and becomes like a real decider. But he really pioneered this Bitcoin as a reserve asset. And now is saying that he would like, just as much Bitcoin as gold, which is very large numbers because allegedly, we don't know because the Fed has never been audited, but allegedly at Fort Knox, if the Fed hasn't stolen all of America's gold, then that's going to be a pretty sizable thing. But we get to audit that because Bitcoin allows for audit and allows for some of the corruption that can happen with gold not to happen with Bitcoin. And so that kind of brings us all full circle. You are right now at Bitcoin 2024, the largest Bitcoin conference in history, and RFK is about to take the stage. And we've got these central banks which represent the global north. The Federal Reserve is exporting all of this inflation around the world. The IMF is then exporting all of that to destroy countries. And then you have these smaller central banks and finance ministers that are depleting all of their dollar reserves. Inflation is destroying their countries. It's getting, more and more poverty and more debt slavery across the global south. Is there an opportunity in this moment today where the global north could fight against the oppression of their central banks, use Bitcoin as a counterforce, and therefore we can slowly unwind the impact that these global north central banks like the European Central Bank, the Bank of England, the Federal Reserve are impacting upon the global South? That's a massive question and more of a diatribe, but I'd love your perspective of what you're seeing on the ground in Bitcoin 2024 with RFK about to take the stage.
Yeah, that's such a good question, and a big question, as you said. I think we're seeing massive traction. Behind the scenes, there are a lot of interesting conversations happening in countries around the world. I saw your last interview with Dennis Porter, which I think was fantastic. And I think that, more and more people are waking up, right? You realize that the problem with money is that from time immemorial, man has always abused his power with money, right? And so you have to trust that man won't do the wrong thing with money, which is dilute it and debase it. That's the story of monetary history, right? And the story of Bitcoin is just very clear. It's, wait, instead of having to trust anyone or any group of people, let's make it so that we don't have to trust them to do the right thing. Let's make it so they can't do the wrong thing. And that's fundamentally different. And the more and more people who wake up, the more popular that idea becomes. You can't unsee it once you see it. So I think education is the input to the equation that outputs the adoption result, right? So input, education, output, adoption, understanding, empowerment. And I think a lot of people are going through that cycle right now. And so that's why I'm focused on education at all levels. So there are conversations that are happening behind the scenes. There are, state representatives who are learning about Bitcoin. There are university heads who are learning about Bitcoin. There are senators who are learning about Bitcoin, and they're all looking for a good resource to use to do that. And that's actually, a great, that's actually why we created a Bitcoin diploma, right? To walk you through the full history, the full monetary history, and then so you fully understand the problem. So you're ready for the solution, because if you understand the problem, you'll recognize the solution. And I think a lot of people are using the Bitcoin diploma, Buy My First Bitcoin, to kind of understand this stuff. And it's kind of like that meme, you've seen the meme where the slave driver is cracking the whip and the masses are all bowed down. And then one guy stands up and he says, you know what, I'm just going to stay standing. And then the other kind of slaves look at him, and then 2 and 3 stand up. And before you know it, the whole audience, the whole, slave base has stood up, and the guy cracking the whip is now bowing down. I think what has happened is you and a couple of the early guys were the guys who were very, unpopular, shadow banned and silenced, because you had a very important message to share with the world. And if you think about kind of that whole adoption curve and where we are in that, kind of innovator, early adopter kind of stage, I think we're about to reach the stage where, we cross the chasm in the next, year or so. Politically, all the financial guys are here and they're excited about it. I'm getting calls from, family offices and institutions saying, hey, we don't have a Bitcoin strategy. We don't have a Bitcoin education plan. We need one. And so there, that kind of gradually then suddenly moment seems to be closer to us now than it's ever been before. But I think what happens is it's going to be state by state. And the really hard problem to solve is the one that you shared, right? Who's the final boss, right? It's the central bankers. And unless we have a really clever solution for that, I think we're going to see, even in many of the countries that I work that are friendly with Bitcoin, banks remain a tough problem to be solved. So I'd be curious to get your input on how we develop, either it's a co-op or other strategies to kind of work around them.
What you highlight is there's no one person in this movement that can solve. With the Dennis Porter interview, what I wanted to highlight is that one organization and a bunch of people that joined that in order to really speak the political language, the lobby's language, and really tackle that one and tackle it really well. So, if you're being fed that Bitcoin's bad for your country, that needs to be repackaged as a narrative that helps politicians understand how this is good for jobs, how this is good for the future of the country, good for the state, because Bitcoin does solve many, many problems. And so it just needs to be understood from the perspective. Now, when that comes to the global south and other countries which are trying to have more sovereignty and have to have, trying to stamp out various other forms of corruption that is similar things, but very, very different packages. This is a massive, massive global educational movement of, and I love the name, La Primera Bitcoin. I think that's where you started in Spanish, my first Bitcoin. Of educating people on how to get their first Bitcoin. Now, why I think that's really smart and really clever is because I got Bitcoin theoretically when I went to the first Bitcoin conference, but it wasn't until I tried to purchase it. I put some Bitcoin on my phone and then I sent it to my wife and said, right, how do we send this thing? And then you're looking at your phone and you're like, okay, that was really easy, but where's the bank account? And you're like, oh, right, okay, well, this is stored on my phone. What if I lose my phone? And then you're like, okay, well, maybe I need to store it somewhere else, because if that value is a lot more. And then you're sending it and you're like, zero confirmation. What does that mean? Who's confirming it? And you're like, all right, there's all these miners confirming it. 1 confirmation, 2 confirmation. All right, that took 10 minutes in order to get that confirmation. So there's this network of miners. And then I'd send it to my wife and she'd be like, oh, I could see that on the blockchain. I'm like, what? How did you know that I sent that? All right, it's transparently published everywhere, but it's just a line, a string of numbers. What does that mean? Does that mean that no one knows it's me? All right, okay, so it's pseudonymous. That has implications. You get your first Bitcoin and you hear that first blip, and it sent the Bitcoin, and I'll never forget it for the rest of my life. I'll say, wow, that Bitcoin existed on my phone. You opened an account on your phone. We sent that person to person. There was no bank in the middle. Now, what's the monetary policy? All right, okay, so that's all programmed. So I know exactly how many Bitcoin there is going to be in 2136 to the decimal place, based upon a monetary policy that's enforced by maths and code with the largest distributed supercomputer in the world, with hundreds of thousands of node operators that are all ensuring the integrity, with geopolitical neutrality, because some of it's being mined in America, some being mined in China, some being mined in Russia, some being mined in Iran. And I don't see any of those countries all colluding together when they all want to bomb each other. So therefore, no government controls this system, and we have achieved geopolitical neutrality. And it's all about, for me, just bringing it straight back to the micro. Every single person in the world at some stage needs to know what it is like to get their first Bitcoin and to send their first Bitcoin. And if you're having this open source education and sitting down on the ground with this network of people that want to bring that out and repackage it in their language to their country in a way where the politics make sense to them, so they can understand it's a different problem in America, it's a different problem in Colombia, it's a different problem in El Salvador, but it solves many, many problems. And so, that's why I just want to get you as much exposure as you can, and make sure that people understand that there are people like you on the ground doing this work. And this is one big, big, big community that every halving cycle adds bigger and bigger and bigger players, institutions. Now there's banks, financial institutions. Eventually there'll be central banks, because if you can't beat us, you end up joining us. And everybody will get their first Bitcoin eventually. It's just a question of when. Is that type of excitement? Is that what you're seeing at Bitcoin Nashville right now?
Yeah, that was very well said. I mean, it's inevitable, right? It's not if, but when. And the excitement here is palpable. I'm getting phone calls in between meetings, in between phone calls, in between texts from friends that I haven't spoken with in a very long time. And you really see, people are waking up, right? People are waking up, and education is how we wake them up. And so, the movement, right, that is happening around the world in its own cultural context, taught by someone from the community, because not everyone wants to know the history of every currency, but they want to know the history of their currency. They want to understand, how come everything costs me more? How come my purchasing power is being devalued, even if they don't use those words to say it, right? So, my focus and a lot of the teams that I'm working with around the world are doing their best to create the systems and the tools that others can use, so that they can go off into their own community and use their own language and their own cultural context to wake up their communities. Because it is when everyone understands this stuff and starts asking the right questions that we all kind of say, you know what, this is the right way. This is a right. I think that's an interesting thread, and maybe something to double click on, is Bitcoin ownership is a right. You have the right, if money is your time and your energy stored in a vessel for future consumption or future use, then you have the right to store your energy kind of however you want. And an interesting project that I think, and an interesting narrative that's happening behind the scenes, is like, how do we make that a human right? Right? There's 30 human rights currently in law. How do we make a 31st one? How do we codify that into law to protect people to store their life's energy, their time, in the monetary instrument of their choice? And so there'll be more to come on that later. That's kind of a newer idea under development, but it's something I'm very excited about.
Really love that idea. Thank you very much for sharing that with us. So Bitcoin, or the ability to store and own your own money as a human right. Our parents lived in, my late father, he doesn't understand this world of, if I want to spend my money, I need to pass KYC and I need to get permission to spend that money. Our parents came from a generation that if you ever ask them all those intrusive details about what they're doing with their money, if the bank called them and asked those details, they tell you where to go. And yet our society have hit a world because many of the trends where I don't believe I own my money at a bank. I think I'm lucky to be able to spend it. I know that it's going to take me ages to be able to send that around the world. And I know if I want to contribute money to feeding children in Gaza because of the humanitarian crisis that's been created, or if I want to send some money to Colombia, I'm going to be accused, guilty until proven innocent, of being a drug trafficker or a terrorist financier. Or if I want to send some money to WikiLeaks because I believe that protecting the American Constitution, even though I'm not American, I believe that the Constitution is one of the greatest documents to protect Americans from the government. That I believe that their First Amendment right should allow for us to have a website like WikiLeaks, and that when the UK government isn't freeing Assange and is taking people to prison for creating peer-to-peer websites and technology, and is fighting against that, then they should have the ability for us to be able to expose all the lobby groups and all the vested interests that are fighting against the people's interests. And services like WikiLeaks, which is a Bitcoin story, is a fundamental protection of human rights against the atrocities, because absolute power corrupts absolutely. And Bitcoin giving us the ability to own our own money, to spend our own money, and to protect ourselves from the central banks that are debasing our value is a human right. And any type of initiative to help people understand and make, put that as a human right, a 31st human right. I think you said that's brilliant. And I wholeheartedly support it. One of the things that I love about what we're going to see with RFK is that RFK knows what it's like to be in his family the enemy of the deep state. He knows what it's like to stand up against certain powers. And his family has a long history of that costing them their life. He understands how the war machine works. He understands how lobby groups are engaged in the process of forever wars, which allows central banks to print money, which is all sorts of human rights violations and atrocities that we are seeing all around the world right now through proxy wars. And many people don't know because they've lost the relationship between their money and what's happening with their money. They don't know what's happening. And RFK is out there spreading the good word, protecting people's ability to own Bitcoin and making that ingrained into Bitcoin. And then obviously Trump picked some of that up to get some votes. We'll see whether he means it or not. But there's only half the story as well, because we know that Trump and RFK and the Democrat side, we know it was Biden and now it's Kamala Harris. We know that they're all funded by the same lobby groups. And so half of what they say we can trust, and the other half we can't trust because they got to play the game of politics. And you'll notice these common trends in the things that they can't talk against, because that's where a lot of their funding is coming from. And you'd be able to control politics through lobby groups. So it's this ability to have the constitutional protections, the human rights that comes from owning your own money, this world that we found ourselves in where we can communicate for as long as we can communicate. And then the ability to hold the politicians account, because we know the money is half of their narrative. And we get to participate in all of that. Why? Because of this one little crazy experiment that should never have succeeded, of being able to create Bitcoin and fund all these things around the world. And now it's just hitting that level of success that I never imagined we could ever get here. I know I always talked about it, but there's a difference between believing something and it actually happening. But it seems like we've hit that escape velocity. And so, yeah, where do you see this going next? Where's the whole, you as an American person or somebody in America that spent a lot of time in the global South? How do you see this whole understanding that people are getting through understanding Bitcoin that maybe even helps them see that, right, my US dollar, my British pound, and my euro is causing these deaths for other people. My freedom is somebody else's oppression. And we've got this global currency that now, through Bitcoin education, the whole world starts to make sense. It's like this unearthing, this uncovering of change money, change the world. Bitcoin and proof of work as a force for peace. And everybody getting it through education and seeing, wow, let's just connect the dots. This is a truly global movement. And maybe we can't just support these, this thing that helps us, but is so oppressive to others. How do you see that?
Oh man. So this is an amazing conversation. I think the 31st human right? Because if money is a representation of your time, it's also a representation of your life. If you don't own your own money, you don't own your own life. And that's just the truth. And that's just something that people are waking up to. And so I think we're a serious society if we all agree that we should protect that and codify that, and not just for one country, but for all of humanity, right? So I think that to me is such an important movement that I want to put serious time and resources behind. So we have to talk about that offline. But to RFK, right? You have to understand the problem to recognize the solution, right? This is someone who understands the problem that, what happens if you say the wrong thing? What happens if you disagree, even if it's polite? And I don't know if you know this guy, but it's this like obscure reference that I think really applies well to what you and I are discussing. There's a guy named Ignaz Semmelweis, and he's known as the father of infection control. Have you heard of him by any chance? Yeah. Okay. So I'm going to tell a brief story. I'm not going to go, too far, off topic, but Ignaz Semmelweis. So this was a physician who had a clinic, and he delivered babies. And what he noticed is about 1/5 or about 20% of the women who were delivering babies were dying in his clinic. And he noticed by doing a scientific inquiry that a lot of the physicians delivering babies in his clinic would go from operating on cadavers to delivering babies. Now, you and I shake our heads instantly going, oh, that's not good. But at the time, that was controversial because doctors didn't want to be told that they should wash their hands in between procedures. So what Semmelweis does is he says, hey, we're going to do a chlorinated hand wash between procedures. He dropped mortality rates from 20% to 2%. Do you know what the medical community did to him? They put him in an asylum where he died. And it wasn't until, tens of 50 years later where he was proven right and he was validated by Joseph Lister and Louis Pasteur, who developed microscopy and could see the germs on your hands. And of course, he was vindicated post-mortem, but it didn't matter. So why do I tell this story? The people who tell the truth sometimes aren't treated well by society. Their message lives on. And eventually, I think, historically, intelligent people converge on truth. They find the right solutions to the problems of the day. But there's a price to pay for being early and right, especially when there are powerful people who disagree with you. And I think of RFK and I think of you as examples of people who seek truth. Like, we don't care if it's not popular. We've done the scientific inquiry. We found out how to reduce those mortalities. We found a solution that we want to share with the world that creates a brighter future for humanity. And that's beautiful. And so that's the kind of future that I'm here to fight for. That's the global currency. That's the global initiative. That's when you say, Simon, Bitcoin is peace. I resonate with that exactly. Right. But that's an advanced understanding. And so, I'm just laser focused on, distributing education as far and wide and in the right cultural context as possible. Because when everyone comes to that understanding, we're gonna move the world.
3 more. It was 20 years ago in 2004 that I was it 2004? Yeah, 2006 when I left, 18 years ago, investment banking, because I discovered in my brief career the atrocities that working for an investment bank meant. Tried to change the system from within. It wasn't really going anywhere. Tried to engage in politics and help people understand how money is created. That didn't really go anywhere. And then found the Bitcoin community, and I found this group of people that just didn't care what anyone else was thinking. I remember some of the real early people that are very controversial characters, like Amir Taki, who invited me to that first Bitcoin conference. He used to say some very, very controversial things, and he was the face of Bitcoin at the time. Disagreed with a lot of it, but actually he was quite ahead of his time on certain things. And he moved into a squat in London, in Old Street, where he was working with the early coders and Bitcoin developers. And he was the face of Bitcoin at the time. And he just used to say really crazy things that I just couldn't quite understand. Money laundering is just what your government says is money laundering. And, to me, that sounded like a really wacky type of thing at the time. But it's a profound thought. And then you suddenly realize, well, yeah, there are certain things where these laws are used in order to service a certain agenda, and it may not be within our rights. But this is the type of thing that I've just seen time and time again over Bitcoin's history. A group of people that, if they continue to buy Bitcoin every month, spend, let's say, earn and invest the difference, save in hard money, I've seen more and more people break the cycle and achieve financial freedom. And once they're no longer worried about how to pay their next rent, and they're no longer worried about their future, their best type of thinking comes out. And they have the freedom to breathe and realize that they can contribute something to this global movement. And by having more financial freedom, it actually brings out some of the best of human behavior, rather than the worst in human behavior comes when you're deeply in debt. You know, think about the worst in human behavior. You're deeply in debt, you feel like you got no choice, and you were brought up in an environment where you knew nothing else but crime, and all you could ever do was engage in crime. That was your destiny, written to you by the debt-based fiat system. And people that get to break through that by having hard money, by being able to beat inflation, by being able to fight the atrocity of central banking, they're not going to come to that conclusion. But they may find Bitcoin. And when they find Bitcoin, they may be exposed to a group of really quirky, interesting people. And their financial IQ might go up and up if they do their first La Premiere Bitcoin, or get their first Bitcoin. And really, I have seen firsthand that the more and more people that get their first Bitcoin, the more and more people that do it on their phone the way it was designed to be, they may start with an ETF. But then when they can't access it, they'll start to ask those questions. And the more and more people that do that, and then they get to break free from the oppression, from the debt slavery, and they're able to even pay off their debts using the value that they've saved over the long term. These are the very people that bring their experiences and make up the Bitcoin community, and this collective intelligence that is having such a profound impact on the world. And I completely agree that we are now at the stage where more and more and more people are joining. We've hit the exponential phase. We've hit this critical mass. This isn't a question of does Bitcoin survive? This is a question of who is going to get on that early. And you know what? I was lucky. I was at the right time at the right place where I was trying to create a bank, and I was deep in debt. And it's not all luck. Look, we know we make our own luck, but there is an element of luck. I was born in a certain place. I was given a certain opportunity, and I was able to find Bitcoin at the exact right moment when I would get it. And there was an element of skill. I kept buying it. I didn't sell it. You know, most people didn't do that. But I understood the power of what hard money can bring to the world. And the more and more people that understand that, the more we can make just this really, really big difference from this open source technology and now open source education, and all the challenges that we're all going to be faced. And we just need more and more people like you, using whatever you're best at, whatever your skills at, joining the Bitcoin community, and just frantically trying to find as many people that want to learn about this right now, because the reality is those on the wrong side of this trend, we have discovered means that can mean death, assassination, at the highest level, assassination at the highest level, but just pure death and destruction as we're seeing people on the wrong side of the war. And all of that is based upon whether you were born close to the right central bank, and whether your central bank and you had the education to figure out how to break the cycle. And the only way I know where everybody can break the cycle is by understanding hard money and Bitcoin. And so keep pushing that education. Is there anything you want to leave the audience with? And where can they find you and support you in trying to bring this open source education and Bitcoin to more people?
Yeah, no, I mean, I just really found the discussion super valuable, and I wanted to double click on something before I go, which is critical mass, right? Like, I don't know if this resonates, but we use Fahrenheit to gauge water temperature in the U.S., and so I still use that instead of Celsius, where I've spent a lot of my time in South and Central America. And I think about it like this: like the difference between boiling water, like water state, and a gas state, is 211 degrees versus 212 degrees Fahrenheit, right? It's 1 degree difference, and you have to boil and raise the temperature of water to a very high state to do this. But once you get to 211 degrees and you go to 212 degrees, you get a phase change. It changes from liquid to gas. And I think critical mass wise on the timeline, we're very close to that moment happening. And I think it probably happens fairly soon. And the generational impact of that, right? Like your dad teaching you about money enabled you to learn about money, enabled your next generation to learn about money. And that's what we want to do. We want to change the cycle. So that's what I spend a lot of my time thinking about, designing systems in education that breaks the cycle, that leads to more long-term thinking and less short-term thinking and suffering as a side effect. So I just wanted to share that with you and just say I really love this chat. I mean, I feel like there's so many things to talk about on health literacy and initiatives that are going on all around the world. But for me, you can find me on Twitter. I think Adam_Nili, Nili. You can find my link tree on my profile, which shows all the various projects that I'm kind of behind the scenes, just generally supporting and supportive of. My life's mission is to work on financial literacy and health and nutrition literacy for the world. That's the problem I'm here to solve. I collect dots, I connect dots, and I put them into action. And it's just been a pleasure to speak with you today, and looking forward to the next one, man.
I'm going to ask one more question and then we're going to close off. But if you're speaking, like a lot of my audience are from the global South and the global North, I get a lot of criticism. I'm used to criticism, always had criticism. But when I say things as I see them, and if I get it wrong, I'll say that I'm wrong. But I'm pretty sure that much of what I'm going to be covering, and in Bitcoin Hard Talk episode 40, which is going to be about an hour after this, I'm going to be covering why China needs Bitcoin just as much as America, and why US is being pushed into a war with Iran right now, and how that impacts Bitcoin. But many people, they get caught into this kind of patriotism of the propaganda that their government is giving them. And I try and break people free from that propaganda. And sometimes people interpret that as me being an enemy to their country, or being an enemy to their narrative or their left and right leaning politics. And what I've always tried to do is actually just focus on the truth. You said it before, that I will always share the truth as I see it, whether it's inconvenient, convenient or not, and politically neutral. But I have often seen that people are a function of the propaganda that their government feeds them on their TV feed. And we're starting to break that, which is causing a lot of discourse. But, a lot of my comments will be like, if I'm talking about a country like Iran, they have a perception that the media has told them that they need to think about that. And that's based upon a perception of them living in America or living in the UK. And I try to always give them the other side of the story and then help them understand, actually, there's propaganda from every side. And this whole concept of good guys versus bad guys when it comes to government is actually just some real evil governments and our ability to stand up against them. And the people are often very, very different to the reflection of their governments. And so when I'm criticizing governments, I'm not criticizing people. I'm saying that you may be from a country where your government's doing real evil shit and you should not be defending it. You should be standing against your government. And I know in certain countries we're able, and I feel like I can talk against my government without risking the fate of others that get assassinated. And other countries you can't speak because you take a real risk to your safety by speaking out. So we live in all different areas of freedom. But one thing I've always tried to do is give a voice to those that are oppressed as a result of those that have freedom of speech in countries that don't have freedom of speech, and try and understand that there is this global north and global south divide. And I spent much of my time traveling all around the world. And in a couple of years, I've visited like 40 different countries. And what you are taught by your government is often, if you won the war, you get to write history. And if you lost the war, you don't get to write history. And it's never the truth. It's just what you're taught. And so from your experience of living in the global north and the global south, do you find that many people don't understand that the things that they are standing for is actually really, really detrimental to other people in other countries, and they just don't have the voice that you have? And how can we change that?
It's amazing that we end here, because this could almost be the beginning, right? This point of synthesis. We have brothers and sisters all over the world who were born in a country. They didn't choose their country. They didn't choose their name or their sex. They were born into that. And when I travel around the world, all I see are brothers and sisters. And I would love for everyone to see the other as themselves. That fundamentally changes the way you interact with humanity. It changes the way you think about the world, and your contribution to it, right? We're here to contribute. We're here to learn, to create. And I just think that, unfortunately, these lines that divide us come from outside ourselves. And they're read-write executable files that go into our minds that just go into execute mode without us really stopping and thinking. And I think, Simon, you and I, we don't eat fast food. Why? Because we understand we're this big biomass of cells that are constantly regenerating and building from the food that we eat. Similarly, so we don't eat fast food because fast food is garbage. Well, mass media is fast food for the mind, right? Just think about that. If you see mass media as fast food for your mind, and you think about your mental diet, then maybe instead of watching some of the programming, right? It's even called programming, that you just sit and turn on the TV and you mistake for education. You start to see it and categorize it appropriately. And if you do that, your whole world will change, because you start to think from first principles. You start to think from a humanistic perspective, and you start to just be more grounded in who you are as a human, as a sovereign being, and wanting sovereignty and wanting a good life for everyone else around you. And that to me is like the ultimate life hack. So, for me, it's guys like you, it's teams like OpenSats, it's teams like Paystand, it's teams like Blocks. There's a group of people who are very, who want to shape the world and who are unafraid to share the truth. And I see this movement, a lot of this is behind the scenes coming together as all of us standing up together. And when we do that, we will encourage others to do so too. And when everyone stands up together, the guy cracking the whip, he's going to bow.
That's the perfect place to end. Adam, we could talk for hours and hours longer. Do come back when you've got anything significant that you want to share and you think you're not getting enough attention to that message. As long as you're continuing to do what you're doing, supporting Bitcoin and helping more and more people, you'll always have a platform here. And anybody that believes that this is a message that more and more people need to see, then please do share, please do like, please do retweet, please subscribe, please put comments, because it helps the algorithm. Often the messages that we want to bring out to the world are not popular with the algorithm. Fortunately, Bitcoin gave me financial freedom, so I don't need to monetize. And so they can't use that weapon against me of demonetization, because I'm not even monetizing this content. But the real tragedy of some of the things that Adam just said there is that we actually do live in a world where even the basics of eating nutritional food is actually a privilege that's only bestowed between those who have financial freedom, because even eating good, nutritious food is expensive, and inflation has taken that as an option, that even going out and eating fast food in this inflation is becoming a luxury item for some people, because we're at the end of that debt cycle. Big change ahead. Always remember, don't lose friends, don't lose your family because they sit on the left and they sit on the right. Remember, we're often just a function of the propaganda that we're fed. Don't make enemies of people because they have a different skin color or see things from a different perspective. We're all very, very passionate people. We need to learn from each other more. And Bitcoin is that great unifier and that great equalizer. And always stand up for those that don't have a voice. And we're all here to serve humanity. And I think Bitcoin has given the ultimate contribution to the world. So I'm going to go live in about just under an hour from now at Bitcoin Hard Talk episode 40. We're going to be discussing, as always, an incredible amount of stuff that has happened this week. And Adam, thank you very much for sharing your message, and enjoy Bitcoin 2024 in Nashville. Peace.